Right now, there are people alive who remember living in a country that no longer exists. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and 15 new independent nations were born overnight. But what if that flag never came down? What if Gorbachev's reforms succeeded instead of triggering collapse? Today, we're diving into the alternate reality where the Soviet Union survived, adapted, and still controls a sixth of the world's land in 2025. Let's start with what actually happened. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was dying. The economy was stagnant, the war in Afghanistan was a disaster, and people were tired of empty store shelves and government lies. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced two reforms: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. His goal was to save the Soviet Union by making it more flexible, more honest, more sustainable. It backfired spectacularly. Glasnost allowed people to finally speak the truth about how bad things were, and once they started talking, they couldn't stop. Perestroika tried to introduce market elements into the economy, but it created chaos instead of prosperity. By 1991, the whole system collapsed. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in Moscow, the hardline coup failed, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. But in our alternate timeline, Gorbachev gets it right. The reforms in 1987 are more carefully managed. Instead of sudden openness, there's gradual transparency. Instead of chaotic economic restructuring, there's a planned transition to a mixed economy, socialism with market characteristics, similar to what China would later implement in our timeline. The key difference? Gorbachev moves faster on economic reform and slower on political liberalization. In our world, he did the opposite, and it killed the USSR. In this timeline, by 1990, Soviet citizens can start private businesses, foreign investment is cautiously welcomed, and the command economy slowly transforms into something more flexible. The hardliners in the Communist Party are unhappy, but they're not desperate enough to launch a coup. The economy is actually improving. Store shelves are filling up. The standard of living is rising for the first time in decades. People are willing to give the system more time. The critical moment comes in 1991. In our timeline, this is when everything fell apart. But in this timeline, the August coup never happens because there's no need for it. The Soviet Union isn't collapsing, it's evolving. The Baltic states still want independence, but Gorbachev negotiates a deal. They get autonomy within a new union of Soviet sovereign republics, similar to how the European Union would later operate. More freedom, shared currency, open borders, but still technically one nation. By 1995, the Soviet Union looks completely different. Moscow has McDonald's and Starbucks, but they operate as joint ventures with Soviet state enterprises. Billboards advertise both Communist Party achievements and Western products. It's bizarre, contradictory, but it's working. The economy grows at 5% annually. Not Chinese miracle numbers, but enough to keep people satisfied. Politically, the Communist Party maintains control, but it's more like modern China than Stalin's USSR. There are local elections for city councils. There's limited press freedom. You can criticize local corruption, but not the party itself. Dissidents face harassment, but not gulags. It's authoritarian, but it's not totalitarian anymore. Vladimir Putin, in this timeline, is still a KGB officer, but he's working in the Economic Intelligence Division, helping Soviet companies compete globally. He never becomes president because there's no Russia, there's still the USSR. Yeltsin is a regional governor, not a national hero. The oligarchs who dominated 1990s Russia never get the chance to loot state assets because those assets never get privatized the way they did in our timeline. So what does the world look like in 2025 with a Soviet Union that never fell? First, the geopolitical map is completely different. There's no independent Ukraine, no independent Georgia, no independent Kazakhstan. The USSR still stretches from Poland to the Pacific, controlling 15 republics and 300 million people. NATO didn't expand eastward because there was no vacuum to fill. Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined the European Union but stayed neutral militarily. There's still tension between the USSR and the West, but it's more like the original Cold War détente managed competition, not the aggressive posturing of our current era. The Ukraine crisis of 2014 never happened because Ukraine is still part of the USSR. There's no war in Donbass, no annexation of Crimea, because those territories never left Soviet control. Millions of lives disrupted by conflict in our timeline are living normal lives in this one. But here's where it gets complicated. Central Asia looks very different. In our world, after the Soviet collapse, countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan became independent dictatorships. In this timeline, they're still Soviet republics, but they've developed economically much faster. Soviet investment in infrastructure and education continued instead of collapsing in the 1990s. The flip side, the authoritarian nature of those governments is reinforced by continued Soviet control. Human rights in Central Asia are probably worse in this timeline than in ours, as bad as that might be. Russia itself is more prosperous but less free. Moscow in 2025 looks like a hybrid of Shanghai and Berlin, modern skyscrapers, efficient metro, vibrant culture, but with surveillance cameras everywhere and topics you just don't discuss publicly. The economic chaos of the 1990s never happened, so there's no lost generation of Russians who lived through collapse. But there's also no brief moment of democratic possibility that Russia experienced in the early 1990s. Technology develops differently. The Soviet space program never lost funding, so there's a permanent Soviet moon base by 2015. But consumer technology lags behind the West. Soviet smartphones exist by 2025, but they're clunkier, more restricted, and years behind iPhones. The internet exists, but it's more controlled, more censored, more like China's Great Firewall than the open web. Soviet citizens can access global websites, but the government monitors everything. Social media exists, but political organizing online is impossible. Here's the big question. Is this world better or worse? On one hand, the chaotic, violent collapse of the Soviet Union never happened. No shock therapy economics that impoverished millions. No wars in Chechnya. No oligarchs stealing the nation's wealth. Millions of people who suffered in the 1990s have more stable, prosperous lives. On the other hand, the brief window of freedom that former Soviet citizens experienced after 1991 never opens. No chance for democracy, no chance for true independence, no chance to chart their own course. The Baltic states don't join the EU as free nations. Ukraine doesn't have its Orange Revolution or Euromaidan. Belarus doesn't even get its brief moments of protest. And globally, the absence of Soviet collapse changes everything. Without the triumphalism of winning the Cold War, American foreign policy is more cautious. There's no end of history moment, no sense that liberal democracy inevitably wins. The war on terror might not happen the same way because American attention is still focused on managing Soviet competition rather than Middle Eastern adventures. China rises, but it's more constrained. In our world, China filled the vacuum left by Soviet collapse. In this timeline, it has to compete with a functioning USSR for influence in Central Asia and the developing world. The world in 2025 is more bipolar, more stable in some ways, more repressive in others. There's less chaos but also less freedom. Fewer wars but slower progress. It's a world where the Cold War never really ended. It just evolved into a permanent managed rivalry. All because a set of reforms succeeded instead of failing. All because one leader managed the impossible balance between change and stability. The Soviet Union didn't have to collapse. It chose to, through a series of miscalculations and missed opportunities. And in another timeline, those choices went differently, and the red flag still flies over the Kremlin today.